Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Today I've got another utterly pointless comparison for you. This time I'll be looking at the arcade and Genesis versions of Capcom's Super Street Fighter II. You may think I already covered this game 4 years ago, and if you think that,
well, you're wrong!
That was a comparison of the arcade and SNES versions of the game, which I'll link here for you. Here's a look at the specs of the arcade and Genesis hardware while I tell you just a smidge about the game itself. In 1993, Capcom released its first major update to the monster hit Street Fighter II, Super Street Fighter II, and it was on its brand new CPS2 hardware. It's actually the fourth official revision of Street Fighter II, but the first one to add new characters and new backgrounds. Prior versions just made the bosses playable, recolored the backgrounds, and added a few new moves for existing characters, and had some minor graphical touch-ups. For Super SF2, the backgrounds were all redrawn and are much more detailed and colorful, and the sound system is much more advanced. But gameplay-wise, it's basically the same old Street Fighter II with some gameplay rebalancing. It's still really good, of course, but it wasn't quite the upgrade that I think most people were hoping for back then. Capcom released Super SF2 on many systems, including the Genesis, in 1994. Now, I thought SF2's Special Champion Edition on Genesis, which was a home conversion of Super Turbo, was the best contemporary console version of that game. It had the most authentic music, the gameplay felt tighter than the two prior SNES SF2 ports, and it was just a joy to play. Super Street Fighter II on Genesis is sadly a much different story. It's downgraded from Special Champion Edition in almost every way. It has much worse music and much worse backgrounds, for example. The gameplay is on par with Special Champion Edition, while the voices, sound effects, and character graphics are maybe just a tad touched up. But overall, the entire game feels like a step backward, especially considering it's on a 40 megabit cartridge, the largest ever Genesis game from its commercial lifetime. Alright, recording methodology for this one, I did use save states in both versions to sync up the gameplay as closely as possible, and I played the Genesis version on maximum difficulty. I did move around the barrel bonus stage on Genesis, which is the third bonus stage on that one, but the second in the arcade, so that they'll line up better. And that's pretty much it. Let's get on with it. Alright, here we go. This time around, I've recorded the intro screen as well, so you can see how both games open. And right from the start, we get a pretty good impression of the Genesis version here. They have a really nice version of the animation of Ryu throwing that fireball first person. They do a pretty good job of replicating the title screen. But unfortunately, this is where things start to go south already. As you can see here, everything is kind of shrunk down on the Genesis, but it still seems like it's full screen right now. Don't worry, that impression will vanish in a moment. So still looking good so far, even though we can see everything's obviously smaller. And then here we go. The Genesis version of the game is letterboxed, just like the Super Nintendo version and several other home ports of the era. So we've got smaller characters on Genesis, fewer animation frames, fewer backgrounds, if we're talking about layers for scrolling. Everything is pretty severely cut back. Now, it still looks pretty nice overall when all is said and done for some of these areas. I don't think Guile Stage in particular looks all that bad, but the loss of color is probably the thing that hurts it the most. So there's a lot more color on both the characters and the backgrounds. The much lower resolution, is also a factor, and keep in mind, it's not just the lower resolution, it's lower resolution and occupying less of the screen. So that's kind of a double whammy here. If we took the actual measurements, of how many pixels are actually being filled in during gameplay, you're going to see it's a pretty low percentage, of overall pixels compared to the arcade one. More ratio than percentage, I should say. There, in the arcade version, we've defeated them already, and you've heard the arcade music, now listen to the sad, sad Genesis soundtrack. Now this is the thing that is the absolute worst part about this game in my opinion. Special Champion Edition on the Genesis had really good music. It was very close to the arcade versions of Street Fighter II. At least Street Fighter II, Champion Edition and Turbo, the ones that it, was primarily based on. For this one, the music doesn't even sound remotely close to the arcade Super Street Fighter II. They could have done a much better job with the music here. And one big thing is they lowered the volume a lot, and they took out all of the digital samples. So we have no digital drums or instruments at all in the Genesis version of Super Street Fighter II. So if you're wondering why it sounds so weak and tinny, that's a big reason for it. Now here we go to Fei Long's stage, which I actually think this one looks fine on Genesis. Say, of all the stages in the game, this one actually translated very well. I actually like some of the darker colors a little bit better in the Genesis version than sort of the more washed out ones they used in the arcade. We still have a little bit of a loss of detail in the background, but overall, you know, they did a very nice job translating this one. Now again, we go from a very full soundtrack in the arcade version to this on Genesis. But you'll hear it more in a moment as round 2 begins. But, I mean, this music, it sounds closer in a lot of ways to what we got from Western development companies than most Japanese releases on the system. And if you look at earlier releases on the system, when I'm talking about things that came out right around the time the system was new, stuff like Ghouls and Ghosts, you know, and then even a little bit later, Forgotten Worlds, you know, Strider, anything from Sega in those early days when it was all from the Japanese developers, all that stuff sounded so much better than late Genesis system releases. Things from like 93 and onward. It's like the sound on the system just took a gigantic nosedive halfway through its lifetime, which I think is one of the reasons it's got such a bad reputation for sound. The sound chip in the Genesis is very capable. Or the 2 sound chips in there, I should say. The Master System sound chip isn't great by itself, but in conjunction with the Genesis sound chip, the YM2612 sounds fine. Alright, anyway, here we are in Blanka's stage. So we went from Fei Long's stage, which was one of the best translated stages to the Genesis hardware, to Blanka's, which is one of the worst. I mean, just look at the hut. Look at the floor. Where has all the color gone? You know, obviously the Genesis doesn't have as much color, which is what we've talked about here. Much smaller palettes, much fewer colors available, but still, this stage looks fine in Special Champion Edition. This is a large downgrade from the prior game in the series. How could Capcom have let this happen? It is a mystery. I mean, the only thing I can really think of is they must not have cared all that much about the Genesis version of this game. Maybe sales weren't great on Special Champion Edition, so they decided to not put that much effort into this one. I mean, at least, I hope that's what happened here, because if they did put effort into this, it sure doesn't show. And the spectators in the background don't look all that great either, and that's something we'll see, you know, a lot more of as we get into other stages that are a little more spectator-heavy. But already here, we're getting a bit of a preview of it. They are very low detail on Genesis, they don't have nearly as much color, and they don't have nearly as much animation in those cases either. And when it comes to the music in the Genesis version, which you're hearing right now, sadly, it's really ironic that in Special Champion Edition, Blanka's song sounds a lot more like the version in Super in the arcade originals. However, in Super, it doesn't sound anything like the arcade version of Super. How did this thing like this happen? I don't know. Ask Capcom. Way to drop the ball, people. Alright, here's our car stage. As you can tell, just looking at the floor on this, it's not going to bode well for when we get into Ken's stage. I don't know why there's so much less detail on the floor now than there was in Special Champion Edition. I haven't looked at an official color count for this. I should have done that, because I just have a feeling they could have done a lot better, you know, with the Genesis palettes than they did in this game. Alright, we continue on to DJ, one of the other new characters for Super Street Fighter 2 here. So if you're wondering what Super Street Fighter 2 added to the gameplay of, you know, the prior releases of Street Fighter 2, you know, we have the 4 new characters. There's Fei Long, DJ, T-Hawk, and Cammy. You won't see Cammy during this, you know, full game gameplay, but I did record separate footage of her and her stage that I'll show you at the very end. So we'll see that. Now, DJ's stage here, you know, there's so much less animation on the background characters. This is exactly what I was talking about a moment ago. So you can see that in action right here. But to get back to what's different gameplay-wise, you know, they added some bonuses for, like, the first hit, combos, and, you know, that's really pretty much it. they tweaked a few moves for the existing characters, and we had those 4 new characters. They actually slowed down the gameplay, but in the home version, unlike the arcade version, you can set the gameplay speed so you can make something more akin to like the turbo speed of the last Street Fighter game before this, which was Street Fighter II Turbo. Now, a lot of people in the arcade one, there were complaints back in the day that it was too slow because they got used to the higher game speeds, of Turbo. So it was pretty nice, at least that in the home versions you had the option to up the speed, so you wouldn't be stuck feeling like you were in molasses, which it feels like that sometimes when you're going from high speed to low speed Street Fighter gameplay. Now, the other things in DJ's stage here that really take a hit, aside from music, which you can tell is heavily PSG-based in the Genesis version, the palm trees have way less detail in the background, and the sky has way less detail in the background on Genesis. Everything has less detail, which is going to be par for the course here, and that's what we're going to see in almost every stage. Now, the sound effects, like I said, are a little bit better in Super Street Fighter II on Genesis than they were in Special Champion Edition. They're still not great. I mean, they're digitized, this time around, so they can play through the DAC, but they don't sound clear enough. And I'm going to guess that most of this game's 40 megabit cartridge size probably has to do with the audio samples, which I'm going to guess were probably sampled, at a slightly higher rate than the Super Nintendo game, even though they still don't sound good in this one. There are, fan-made hacks for this that really clear up the voices and stuff. So if you want to hear how clear they could have been, you might want to check those out and see what they're like. Now you can see on the boat here in Ken's stage, one of my complaints in Special Champion Edition and Super on the Super Nintendo was that in the arcade version the boat is leaning. It's on like kind of an angle, where on the home versions the main boat here is completely straight. So it throws off the look of this stage quite a bit. And then, as I mentioned in the bonus round when we were destroying the car, the floor on this stage looks terrible on Genesis. There's like, 4 colors there, maybe? I'm looking at everything in a little bit smaller size right now, but you can tell there's not a lot of color on the floor. And then for the sky and the water, the colors are just super, super weird on Genesis, which I guess you could say is appropriate for Super Street Fighter 2. But yeah, seriously, just look at those things. They don't look good. And I don't understand why the colors they went with, were the ones that they chose. Now we'll polish up Ken in the arcade version here. Now the character portraits, I will say, look really nice. Even though they're smaller and reduced color, they're pretty close to the arcade ones. Reasonably close, I would say. It's just too bad they couldn't replicate that level of quality for the stages. So for T-Hawk, you can see he's still pretty sizable on Genesis compared to the arcade one. The music in the arcade one, again, it's really good. It's on powerful, hardware. For new songs like this one, like, Fei Long's song, like Cammy's and like DJ's, they sound especially impressive, in Super Street Fighter 2. At least the arcade version. In the Genesis version, they all sound like pretty much garbage. They are very, very poor quality instruments. Now, I will say, in Arcade Super, I think most of the songs, even though they're on vastly superior sound hardware, don't actually sound as good as the originals. And they're a little bit samey. It sounds like a lot of them are using instruments that are too similar, and that they were more varied in the weaker sound chip that was used in the prior 3 Street Fighter II releases. So it's not bad, I'll never say it's bad, but I do think some of those songs were better before they got remade for this version of the game. Especially if we're talking about things like Ryu's stage, Ken's stage, Chun-Li and a few others. And then once again here for T-Hawk stage, we can see that there's a lot less animation on the spectators. The ones that are a little bit further in the background don't move at all in the Genesis version, while they have a few frames in the arcade version. And the people standing behind, the guys in the headdresses. So that crowd in the background, almost motionless on Genesis. They added just the tiniest hint of motion on the arms of like a few characters back there. And is it me, or does that look like Cody from Final Fight standing next to the horses on the right in the arcade game? Wonder if he's on the lam in Mexico. And if we look at the building and everything, again, in the background, much less detail. Although there are some things that I've got to say are a little more right about this version in the placement of stuff than, say, the 3DO version of Super Turbo, which I also took a look at, a while back. I'll link that one in the description, too. I think I'll just link all my Street Fighter comparisons in the description, so you'll have them all in one handy place. And man, I hate this barrel bonus round. So like I said in the intro, on the Genesis version of the game, this is the third bonus round that happens after you fight Balrog. In the arcade version, this is the right spot. This is where it occurs. I guess they moved into the Genesis one because they felt it was the most difficult of the bonus rounds, which it is, since every once in a while you'll randomly get a barrel that takes more than one hit to destroy. And that did happen to me in the arcade one there, which is why I only got 16. But oh well, what are you going to do? Right, here we go to Honda's stage, and what is going on with the colors here on Genesis? The Genesis version of this stage looks, I don't know, kind of urine-soaked instead of sort of the subtle, gentle blues of the arcade one. We do also still lose the overflowing tub, which is missing, from the prior versions of Street Fighter on the home consoles. So disappointing that it was missing here yet again. Other than that, pretty much everything from the stage that should be here is here, including the line-scrolling roof in the room, which is nice to see. Or ceiling, I should say. And that was indeed also present in the last versions of Street Fighter II on the system. So there's round one for Honda in the books. And you can see the AI is similar in both also, especially when we're playing on the hardest difficulty on Genesis here. There are some things that are a little different. I actually felt like the Genesis version on its maximum difficulty was really a smidge harder than the arcade version this time around. Not a huge difference, but it's noticeable in some areas. There's Honda taken down on the old arcade version. And there he is taken out in the Genesis version. And you can see the colors and the poster in the background are not so bad. The sun kind of does what it's supposed to. But everything else in that stage is just so off. Alright, and I apologize in advance for Zangief's stage here. I take a little bit longer than I normally would on this because I was messing around with him. And I couldn't remember how long it took me to beat him in the arcade version, so I did lollygag a bit on the Genesis one instead of taking him out as quick as I could, because I was trying to make these matches last roughly the same amount of time. Now, on the Genesis, we do have all the components of the background, which is a plus. We've got the gate in front, we've got the line-scrolling floor, we've got the chain in the foreground, and then we've got, the fence in the background, all the people celebrating, and then the other layer behind it. So they did a pretty nice job translating this background overall, even though there's still a gigantic hit to the colors. And the ceiling in here looks almost reversed on Genesis color-wise from the arcade one. Almost, but not quite. Again, it's a symptom just of the limited color palette on the Genesis, which, it had a maximum of 64 colors it could show on screen with normal modes, without using any trickery, no shadows and highlighting, or any of the other special things you could do. And really that 64 is more like, 60 or 61 when all is said and done because of transparencies. So, they're very, very limited in the amount of colors that were available here. And I can't get over how bad a job they did on the music here. Once again, the music here, I could harp on this in every stage. There's no song on the Genesis version of Super Street Fighter II that is good There are only some that are alright, and then some that are just horribly pathetic and just unlistenable. Alright, we're up to our bosses. I love how the portrait for Balrog has now changed, so he no longer looks like Mike Tyson. I guess Capcom didn't want to be sued. So there's one stage where it doesn't look better than the arcade on Genesis, but you know, the darker colors are better. That weird bright color in most of the background, I don't know if that was supposed to represent like a smoky haze in Vegas or whatever, you know, in arcade Super Street Fighter 2, but it just looks bad. That should have been darker. Meanwhile, on Genesis, the whole thing is maybe a little bit too dark. Also, the Nin Nin Hall sign isn't quite as fancy on Genesis. It doesn't light up in quite the same ways as the arcade version. And the lights on the floors, not quite as fancy on Genesis either. Still, this is one of the better done backgrounds in the game. There goes Balrog down for round 1. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the whole boss naming thing across all the different versions. In the arcade version, originally in Japan, he was Mike Bison, or M. Bison. So M. Bison wasn't the final boss in that version. It was this guy that happened to look an awful lot like M. Tyson. And then our second boss, who is known to us in the US as Vega, he was known as Balrog. Third boss is Sagat. He's the only one who didn't change. And then the final boss, which we know as M. Bison in the West, was Vega in Japan. And those names stuck to the home versions in Japan too. So Capcom wisely decided to change the portrait and the name to avoid getting sued by Mike Tyson. Alright, so here's our final bonus stage. In the arcade, it's barrels, and this is the order that it normally shows up in. It's the first one right after, Balrog. In the Genesis version, this is the second bonus stage. So they switched the order of bonus stages 2 and 3, and of course we've got bricks instead of the barrels. These bricks were introduced in the Super Nintendo port of the original Street Fighter 2. So there's something that is exclusive to the home versions. Why did they take out the barrels and go with the bricks instead? I'm gonna guess it probably had something to do with sprite limits. So anyway, not much to this. Whichever bonus round you're in, just bash some stuff. It'll take a minute or so, and then you'll go on to the next boss, which is Vega. Now here's a stage on Genesis that is really cut back and eliminates a lot of stuff from the background. We have fewer characters in the back, the colors are way darker, and there's almost no detail on the back wall. We do have the fence that comes crashing down, so props to them for including that. But otherwise, this stage just looks very watered down on Genesis. When we lose the guitar players and the rest of the band, the only thing we get are the 2 dancing girls that are in the center. And I have to wonder why they went with some of the color choices here. They could have made it closer to the arcade game, even though, obviously with the Genesis's color limitations, they wouldn't have been able to make it identical. But it could have been way closer than it is. And it's just all so yellowy here on Genesis. And Vega, for some reason, I find him to be a little bit easier in Super than he was in the prior versions of just regular Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition and Turbo. And he's way easier than we would see him in Super Turbo. And Super Turbo is the game, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is the game that followed this one. And I did a version of that, already in my Utterly Pointless Comparisons where we looked at the 3DO game. That game, it adds some, interesting stuff and some real, gameplay elements like the super meter and super finishers and things like that. Stuff that really, you can argue, should have been in this version of the game to begin with. But aside from all that, they also made it super incredibly difficult. So difficult that if you're playing one player, against the computer, it is absolutely no fun at all to play. The computer is just way too cheap. Anyway, Sagat stage here. This is another one where on Genesis, just, come on, what are you doing? Why is the floor one plain color? It would have worked better to have the metallic panels maybe be just, 2 colors instead of like the 4 that they're using, and then putting another couple of colors onto the ground to simulate that texture that we see in the arcade one. I mean, the sunset itself, looks okay. The buildings in the back look alright. But the statue, very low detail on Genesis, and the floor detail is non-existent. And again, so many of these characters on Genesis, they didn't bother to update them at all in any way. And it's a real shame, because they could have made these characters roughly the same size as the arcade game. Now, one interesting thing I'll note here, and I already talked about resolution a little bit, but in the arcade, for Capcom's CPS 1 and 2, they ran at a resolution of 384, by 220, whereas the Genesis is 320 by 220 in its regular mode. So that 384 still ran on a 4:3 ratio, so you got sort of a higher resolution than normal picture when you were playing CPS2 games, which is another reason they just looked like they had so much more detail than most of the home ports at the time. So on Genesis, we're not even running in the Genesis's high resolution mode. We're running in the standard, low res mode, which is closer to 256, by 220 or 240, depending on your region. And the reason for that is they didn't have to resize any of the Super Nintendo assets for that. They could just bring them over and recolor them and not have to do anything else. So, that really held this version back from what it could have been. If these sprites had been designed for the higher resolution on the Genesis, they could have looked so much better. And then also, while we're talking about the music, obviously the critical versions of the songs are cut out from this one, also from the Super Nintendo one, also from most other home ports of the game. We wouldn't hear the critical versions in a home version for a while. And an odd thing is, in the beta version of Street Fighter II, back when it was just going to be Champion Edition on the Genesis, made from different developers, that version's leaked. It's been around for years. I may have shown you a little bit of it in a prior video. If not, we'll look at it sometime. But it has more animation for the characters. It looks like they're slightly different size. And, it's got stuff that's missing from the other versions, including the critical music. And I have to assume the only reason it was missing from Special Champion Edition, and indeed Super in this version when it came out, was to just have feature parity across the board for all the versions of the game. And it's really sad when things are removed that are there, just to, stay on track with a different version of the game that eliminated something. Why do that? When Super came out for the Super Nintendo, they could have added the critical songs and they could have included them in the Genesis port, as long as, they did it in other versions. They could have had feature parity for all versions of Super. Why did they take it out then? I really don't know. I mean, it wouldn't have been, a huge blow to cartridge size for the short, little critical versions of the songs. Now here's the ending, which a lot of it runs a little bit faster on Genesis, which is why I had the pause in there. And that's why you see the portrait of Ryu slide across the screen faster and earlier on Genesis than the arcade. And then, of course, for while Ryu's walking away here, we've got much more animation in the arcade version than we do in the Genesis version. And this one, I can fully understand with the cartridge size restraints. But it's really tough to see, where that extra cartridge space went in this version of the game. Keep in mind, the Super Nintendo version of Super Street Fighter II is 8 megabits smaller than this one. That's a full megabyte less, which back in those days was a huge amount of data. At least, where we're talking about cartridges. So the Super Nintendo version was 4 megabytes, while this Genesis version was 5 megabytes. And, aside from slightly tighter controls, there's really nothing about this version that's better than that version. And I haven't talked about controls much, which I'll do right here at the end. The controls definitely do feel better on Genesis than they do on Super Nintendo. And that includes on real hardware. So in the end here, really what I've got to say is that neither the Super Nintendo nor the Genesis versions of Super Street Fighter II are great. They're both a little bit on the lazy side and relied way too much on existing assets, and Capcom didn't try to do anything to up their game in either version. And while the Super Nintendo version doesn't have a great soundtrack either, I'd say that the graphics and sound superiority in that version definitely make it a more palatable game to play, let's say, than the Genesis one, even though the controls are just slightly better on Genesis than they are in that version. But in the end, both 16-bit home console ports of Super Street Fighter II were a little disappointing, but the Genesis version was definitely more disappointing than the Super Nintendo one. Alright, there we are, a complete playthrough comparison of the arcade and Genesis versions of Super Street Fighter II. Here's a look at Cammy and her stage in the arcade and the Genesis versions, since we didn't get to see those during gameplay. So what did we learn today? Back when both versions were new, the Genesis version was an okay way to play Super Street Fighter II at home. I mean, it had totally fine gameplay, and it was great in that department, but the dramatic hit to the graphics and sounds this time around meant that it really hurt the overall experience. It felt like this time you were playing on dramatically inferior hardware, which was not the case with Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. Now, the Super Nintendo port of Super SF2 ain't exactly great either. It also suffers from being kind of a lazy home conversion that was too dependent on the assets from the prior games on SNES, something which plagued all of the console SF2 ports of this era. The music is only okay in that one, but it's better than the weak, tinny, low-energy Genesis soundtrack. Visually, the Super Nintendo version is also more colorful, and this is one game, though, where in the end, I'd still really only recommend today that you play the arcade version, if any. So tell me, what's your opinion on Genesis Super Street Fighter II? Did you have it when it was new like I did? Did you discover it years later? Do you love it? Hate it? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships, thanks, and that sort of thing. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.